Here's something strange. Elk and deer are cousins. Same family, Cervidae. Same forests, sometimes even the same fields. Deer meat venison is something a lot of American hunting families put on the table every year. It's normal. It's familiar. Elk is a different story. If you find it at all, it's usually on a menu in small portions, priced like something special rather than something ordinary. So here's the real question. If these two animals are this closely related, why did one of them become an everyday food and the other one became a specialty product? The answer isn't really about taste. It's not that elk is somehow inferior. It comes down to something much stranger: how America gradually built a wildlife system that largely shut wild game out of commercial markets. And what happened after that is where this story gets interesting. Let's get into it. Let's start with the most obvious question. Why can't you just buy wild elk meat at a grocery store the way you'd buy chicken or beef? Here's the short version. In the United States, you generally can't. And the reason goes back to a shift this country made over a century ago. Back in the 1800s, wildlife, including elk, was hunted commercially. Meat markets sold wild game the same way they sold beef. And it was devastating. Elk populations collapsed, dropping sharply by the early 1900s. So conservationists, including Theodore Roosevelt, pushed for a completely different approach, what's now called the North American model of wildlife conservation. One of its defining features: eliminating commercial markets for wild game. Wildlife wasn't going to be a product anymore. It was going to be treated as a shared public resource. Now, here's where it gets interesting. This wasn't one single blanket law that works the same in every state. That anti-market principle became a defining feature of American wildlife management, although the exact rules vary by state and species. And that system helped reverse the devastating wildlife declines of the 19th century, including the collapse of elk and other game species. But it also created a side effect nobody was thinking about at the time. It permanently separated wild elk from the food system. If you want elk meat commercially, wild harvest isn't where it comes from. It has to come from somewhere else entirely. Now you might be thinking, okay, so raise more elk on farms instead. We'll get there. But first, there's a second problem sitting underneath all of this. A supply problem. White-tailed deer are everywhere in America. The population runs into the tens of millions, spread across nearly every county in the country. Hunters harvest millions of them annually. Elk are a completely different picture. Their population is dramatically smaller, commonly estimated at around 1 million nationwide, and it's concentrated mostly in a handful of western states, places like Colorado, Wyoming, and Montana. The annual harvest is a small fraction of the deer harvest. So the gap isn't small. It's enormous. Now the question is, why? It's not that elk are harder to hunt or more elusive. It's about where each animal can actually live. White-tailed deer are remarkably adaptable. They do well near farmland, suburbs, and the edges of forests, basically anywhere humans have reshaped the landscape. Elk are more limited. They're generally found across bigger, wilder landscapes in the West, managed across large public lands. They're not absent from human-altered areas entirely, but their range is nowhere near as widespread as deer. So even before you get to farming or selling anything, there's simply a much smaller wild elk population to begin with, concentrated in a much smaller part of the map. But even if you solve the supply problem, even if elk were as numerous as deer tomorrow, there's still one thing standing between an elk farm and your supermarket shelf. Okay, so wild elk is legally off the table, and there aren't nearly as many of them to begin with. So the next logical question is, why not just farm them the same way we farm cattle? This is where things get genuinely interesting. Because even after you solve the legal problem, the deeper issue is this: elk never developed the same degree of domestication, selective breeding, and industrial infrastructure that cattle did. Cattle have had thousands of years of selective breeding, plus roughly a century of industrial-scale American infrastructure built specifically around them. Feedlots, slaughter systems, breeding programs, supply chains, the entire system is optimized for cows. Elk never went through that process at the same scale. They're farmable, some ranches do it successfully, but they're working with wild adjacent animals inside a system that was never built for them. Here's a small but telling example. A basic cattle fence is a few strands of barbed wire on wooden posts. Elk are far more athletic and powerful, so containing them requires much taller, heavier fencing, one real cost among several, before a farmer sells a single pound of meat. Then there's disease management. The National CWD herd certification program is voluntary, but interstate movement of farmed elk and deer is subject to federal CWD requirements, including certification plus additional state rules. So it's not one simple federal mandate. It's a patchwork of certification and movement requirements that adds real cost and complexity for producers. So what does this all mean? It's not that elk farming is impossible. Commercial elk processing itself is legal and established. It's that the overall production system is more specialized and less developed at scale, from fencing and animal management to disease compliance and processing. That's what elk never got. The century of industrial optimization cattle got. And that shows up directly in the price. Specialty elk cuts can sell for several times what a comparable premium beef cut goes for at the store. Elk isn't priced like an everyday protein, it's priced like a specialty product, because in every practical sense, that's exactly what it is. Here's a detail most people never think about. When you see elk on a restaurant menu, it's worth asking, where did it actually come from? Because domestic elk farming in the US is relatively small scale, some commercial elk sold in America is imported. US retailers source at least some elk cuts from places like New Zealand and Canada, where cervid farming operates at a much larger scale. So that elk experience on a menu isn't always the wild, local product people might picture. Sometimes it's farmed a world away. And that connects to the last piece of this, how Americans actually encounter elk as food. Beef, chicken, and pork are foods Americans routinely run into supermarkets, restaurants, everyday meals. Elk is usually encountered in a much narrower context. Hunting culture, specialty butchers, and occasional restaurant menus. That narrower exposure is part of why it never became a default choice the way beef did. There's also a small practical factor. Elk is very lean compared to most cuts of beef. Cook it the way you'd cook a standard steak, high heat, no extra fat, and it dries out fast. Most home cooks have simply never learned how to handle a lean game meat properly, so even people who try it once don't always come back to it. And for what it's worth, despite the reputation, elk generally isn't described as more gamey than deer. If anything, it tends to come across as milder. But that's a footnote here, not the reason. This was never really a taste problem. So let's bring this together. Elk and deer being close relatives never guaranteed they'd end up on the same plate. Being related isn't the same as being equally available, equally farmable, or equally familiar as food. Deer thrive in the exact landscapes humans have built. Elk don't. A wildlife system built over a century ago to save species like elk also cut wild elk out of the food system permanently. And elk never got folded into the massive livestock system built around cattle, so every layer of farming and selling them costs more. So the strange part isn't that elk are too different from deer to become food. It's that they're close enough that the question makes perfect sense. But everything around them, the law, the geography, the economics, and a century of habit, push them into a completely different place on America's dinner table. If you enjoy questions like this, the small, everyday ones that turn out to have a much deeper answer than you'd expect, that's exactly what this channel is about. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.